When it comes to enhancing your designs with boldness, precision and style, fill and stroke effects in InDesign are essential tools for creating impactful visuals. Fill and stroke effects are your secret weapons for making text, shapes and frames stand out. If you want to add bold strokes or vibrant fills, in this video we'll explore how you can make your designs pop. So get comfy and let's have some fun with fill and stroke effects in InDesign. So when working in InDesign, there will be occasions where you will apply a lot of fill and stroke effects to your objects. Here is a poster design where we can see a variety of fill and stroke effects applied, which can add a lot of dynamics to a composition. So let's now get hands-on with fill and stroke effects and see how we can work with them. To do this, let's jump into a worksheet I have prepared earlier. This document can be found in the downloadable folder that comes with this course. This download folder comes with multiple projects and a ton of assets and resources we will be using in this course. You can find the link to acquire the folder from the description. With the download folder open, click into folder 2 practice files and open the practice worksheets InDesign file. If you scroll down to page 2, we can see a variety of worksheets. For this video, we're going to look at the working with images worksheet. So with the selection tool, I'll select the fill and stroke effects thumbnail. Now I'll either come to the links panel and click edit original, or I'll hold Alt on the keyboard and double click on the worksheet thumbnail and the worksheet will open up in its own document. In this practice session, you will learn all the crucial ways you can add fill and stroke effects. So let's scroll down to the second spread and here we can see a number of fill and stroke features. And at a glance here, you can see a lot of effects that can be applied to frames. And these are the following things we are going to look at in this video. So let's now come to the second spread and see all the ways we can work with fill and stroke effects in InDesign. So when working with fill and stroke effects, there are a few key panels you will want to pay close attention to. The stroke panel, the gradient panel and the tools panel. So let's start off with a basic fill. So to begin, come over to the menu, click and hold on the frame tool and select the rectangle frame. I'll click and drag on my pointers here and upon release we will have our first rectangle frame. And by default the frame will be set to transparent. Now when working with fill and stroke effects in InDesign, like in most Adobe programs, we will need to pay close attention to the bottom of the tools menu where we can see the fill and stroke color options. The top square represents the fill color and the square below represents the stroke. Right now we can see that there is a red line going through the squares. This means that currently there is no fill or stroke color applied and these are transparent. So to apply a basic fill is simple. With the frame selected over in the tools menu, make sure that the fill color is selected and here we can do one of two things. We can either double click on the fill color and pick a color and click OK, or we can come over to the swatches panel and select a color from there. Notice now in the tools menu that the left square has the color representing the color applied to the fill of the frame. So when we apply the swatch to fill the frame, we will see the color inside. Now there is another feature you can consider and that is color tint. Right now the color is 100% in the frame. If we come to the swatches panel, we will see this box at the top called Tint, which is currently set to 100%. So with the selection tool, I'll click on my frame and drag to the right while holding Alt and Shift to duplicate the frame across in a straight line. And if we want to change to a lighter shade of color inside, we can simply click into the tint box here and toggle the percentage. If I type 50%, you will see that color change. So it's the same color, but now shows a lighter tint. To create a lighter tint, some may choose to apply a transparency effect, but in some instances this might not be wise if the frame is on top of other objects. So the best way to get a lighter shade of a color is to use the tint. So that's how you could apply a simple solid color to a frame. Now as easy as it is to apply a solid color to a frame, we can also apply a gradient. Now by default, when you have a new document, you might not have a gradient to hand in your swatches panel, but kicking it off is easy. So I'll press and hold Alt and click and drag down to duplicate my frame to match my pointers. With our new frame selected, I'm going to come over and click on the gradient tool in the tools menu and then come and click and drag over my shape like so. Upon release, we will now apply a gradient. Now since I already have a gradient in my swatches panel, it's going to apply that. However, if you were to create a new document and create a frame and add a gradient, by default it would be black and white. Now once we have a gradient applied to our frame, we can change the settings. To do this, we will need the gradient panel visible. If you cannot see your gradient panel, come up to Window, scroll down to Color and click on gradient and up will pop the menu. I have mine over here on the right, tucked nicely on my vertical panel bar. So with the selection tool, I'll click on my gradient square, press and hold Alt plus Shift and drag this to the right to make a quick duplicate. Now with the frame selected, with the gradient applied and the gradient tool visible, we can see we can change a number of settings. First, if we come on the type drop down, we can change the gradient from linear to radial. Also, we can click on reverse to reverse the colors in the gradient. Down below, we will see the two colors that currently make up the gradient. And if we want to change the gradient, we can simply come into the swatches panel, click on a swatch and drag it into the gradient spectrum. And as we do that, we will see the gradient change. Next, I'll drag in two new colors and click and drag on the previous colors and drag them down to remove them. And move my new colors to the far left and right, and now we have a new gradient. In this instance, I'll go with a yellow and an orange gradient. Now in the tools menu, if I right click on the fill square, we can click to add this to the swatches. Next, I'll click back onto my first gradient example, then in the menu, I'll make sure the fill color is selected and I can click on my new gradient. Now, as well as applying the gradient, it has also applied the radial gradient effect. When adding the gradient to the swatches panel, it also kept the settings of the gradient. So if I now want to change this back to a linear gradient, I'm going to have to come back to the gradient panel and simply click the drop down and select linear. And if I want to change the direction of the gradient, I can click the gradient tool in the tools menu and click and drag like so. Easy. So another fill effect to use is an image. For example, if we want to have an image background to create a pattern or texture, we can use an image to fill the frame with a pattern or texture image. To do this is very simple. However, first we will need a frame to place an image inside. So with the selection tool, I'll click on my frame at the top, press and hold Alt and Shift and click and drag down to make a quick duplicate of the frame and place it on my pointers. With the frame selected, either come up to File, Place, or simply press Command plus D on Mac or Control plus D on PC on the keyboard. Upon click, you will bring up a browser window. So I'll navigate to the download folder, into folder 2, practice files, into the assets folder, into the images folder, into the JPEG folder and select the retro texture JPEG. Click open and this will drop the image into the frame. Now, once an image is placed into a frame, there are a number of ways you can fill the image inside. If we press Command plus Alt plus Shift plus E on Mac, or Control plus Alt plus Shift plus E on PC, we can fit the content proportionally inside the frame. This is a good start when bringing images into a frame because you can clearly see all the image inside the frame to begin with. Once we have the image set proportionately inside the frame, this is going to make it much easier to manage. Now we can see the anchor points around the image inside the frame. If I press A to activate the direct selection tool, we can now click on these anchor points to toggle the size of that image to control how much the image fills the frame. With the direct selection tool, I'll place my mouse cursor over the middle right anchor. I'll press and hold Alt plus Shift and click and drag out and we will scale the image up inside the frame. Next, I can just click with the direct selection tool and drag the image around inside the frame to move the image around inside, and I'll press Escape to deselect. Now with the selection tool, we can also click on the frame and move the anchor points around to expand or contract the size of the frame. As we do that, we will see the image remain in position in the frame. So we can do one of two things here. We can change the size of the frame and we can change the image size inside the frame. When working with an image in a frame, you will have to be careful how you manage the frame and how you manage the image inside to get the effect you want. Now before we move on, there is one useful technique you should keep in mind, and that is cloning fill effects from one frame to another. Now as you create layouts in InDesign, you will often apply effects to frames, and as you create new frames, you may want to apply similar effects to those. To do this is really simple. So I'll come to the Tools menu and click and hold on the frame, and this time I'll select an ellipse frame. I'll come over and drag on my pointers to create an empty frame, and by default, this will set to a transparent. Now, if for example, I want to apply the same yellow and orange linear gradient to this circle from the square above, to do this, I can simply come into the Tools menu, click on the eyedropper tool, and with the circle selected, I'll just click on the square, and upon click, that will apply the same fill effect to my circle. However, I will need to click on the gradient tool in the Tools menu and come and click and drag to refine the direction of the gradient. This time, again, I'll click on the eyedropper tool, come up to the top and click on my first fill effect, and that will apply the basic fill. I'll click on the eyedropper tool again, and this time click on the radial gradient. Easy. Now keep in mind, this only works with color fill effects. If I use the eyedropper tool and click on the image, it won't place the image inside. This only works with fill color effects. So those are the main fill options in InDesign. We can use a basic color fill, we can apply a gradient fill, or use an image. So let's now take a look at strokes in InDesign. So when working with strokes, we will typically use them in one of two ways. One way will be to use strokes applied to simple lines, and another will be to use strokes applied to the outlines of frames. Looking back at the overview section, we can see that we have some samples here. We have some basic strokes, and we have some stroke effects applied to frames. So let's start by looking at basic strokes. To begin, come over to the menu and click on the line tool, then come and click on the pointer and drag while holding shift to the next pointer to draw a straight line. Upon release, you will draw a line, but by default, there will be no stroke applied. Now, when working with stroke effects in InDesign, remember to keep an eye on the bottom square in the tools menu under the fill color. Currently, we can see this is set to transparent due to the red line going through it. Also, when working with strokes, we will need to have the stroke panel visible. If you cannot see your stroke panel, come up to Window, scroll down and click on Stroke. Now, if we look in the stroke panel, we can see that there are a lot of options we can toggle when working with strokes. To apply a basic stroke to our line, with it selected, first come into the Tools menu, make sure to click on the stroke square in the background so we can see that above the fill, and in the stroke panel, I can click on the weight option to set this to 3 points. Press V to activate the selection tool, and click off to deselect. So that's how you can apply a basic stroke. Simply draw a line and set the weight. Now also keep in mind that just like with the basic fill, we can also apply a color to the stroke. This time, with the stroke selected at the bottom of the Tools panel, we will need to pay close attention to the square beneath the fill color. If we click this, we will select the stroke color, which we can come into the swatch panel and click to apply any color we like. Also, keep in mind if you want to change the color to a lighter shade, we can come up to Tint and change the percentage. Now, in InDesign, there's a whole variety of different types of strokes we can use. Once we have created one stroke, it's really easy to duplicate and start applying alternative stroke styles. So with the selection tool, I'll press Alt plus Shift and click and drag on my stroke to quickly duplicate the stroke down in a straight line. With my new stroke, in the stroke panel, if we come down halfway, we can click on the drop down for type and see a number of stroke types. As we click through these, we will see the various stroke effects on offer, from lines, dots, dashes, and wavy lines. So a lot of variety on offer initially. However, if you want to be more particular, there is an option to edit and save our own custom strokes. So with the selection tool, with the stroke selected, I'll press and hold Alt plus Shift and drag down to make a quick duplicate. Now, a very common stroke effect used is the dashed line. With the stroke selected, I'll come into the stroke panel, click down on type and select dashed. Upon clicking the dashed line, we will now see these boxes where we can type in some values to allow us to toggle the distance between the dashes on the stroke. So with the stroke size set to 4, in the first box I'll type in 5 for dash, click into the next box, and we will see the dashes decrease in size. Next I'll type 35 in the gap box, click into the next box, and we will increase the space between the dashes, and now we have what looks like a dashed line with little squares. So that's how you can edit a dashed stroke effect. Now let's say you want to save this stroke effect to make it easy to apply to other objects. If I come up to the top right of the stroke panel and click the menu box, we can click on Stroke Styles. Upon click, a menu will appear where we can see our current styles. If we come and click New, up will pop a new menu where we can define more settings. So to match my stroke, I'll set the length to 1, set the pattern length to 8, and the weight to 4. In the preview, I can see that I have what looks like a dashed line with little squares. Once I'm happy with the appearance, I'll name this stroke Little Square and click OK. And now we can see our new stroke visible in the Styles category. So I'll click OK, then come and click on my first basic stroke line, come into the stroke menu, click on the drop down, and now we can see our new stroke is present. If I select this, we will apply the new custom stroke to the line. Now, if this is not perfect, we can edit this. So back up to the stroke menu, click Stroke Styles and click Edit. Now we can see on the preview, and as we edit the stroke, we will see it updating in real time. Here I'll push the pattern length to 13, click OK, and now I have redefined my stroke. Easy. Now when working with strokes, another feature to keep in mind is stroke caps. With the selection tool, I'll click on my first basic stroke, and while holding Alt plus Shift, I'll click and drag down to make a quick duplicate in a straight line. With it selected, I'll come into the stroke panel, I'll push the weight up to 25 and set the color to blue. So right now we have this really thick stroke. If we come into the stroke panel and look at the top, you can see that just under weight, we have this option called cap. Now, by default, we will have the butt cap setting applied, but if we click the option next to this, we can apply the round cap. So keep in mind, when using strokes, if you want to get a rounder edge instead of the harsher edge, you can click on the round cap. This can also work well on dashed lines. If we come up and select on a stroke set to a dashed line, if we click the round cap, we can see that we still have the dashed line, but this time with rounded edges on each dash. Now, another useful effect we can apply to strokes is endpoints. This can be quite useful when creating diagrams or infographics. So I'll click on our first stroke, and while holding Alt plus Shift, I'll click and drag down to duplicate. Now, if you look in the stroke panel, you will see that towards the bottom, we have start and end points. What we can do here is click on the drop down and select from one of the many endpoints. In this instance, I'll click on the start drop down and click on a circle. Now, if we want to swap this to the other side of the stroke, I can hit the swap button in the middle between start and end, and that will move it to the other side. I'll click on the drop down again on the left and this time select a circle solid. Now keep in mind, as you change the stroke size, the proportion of the endpoints will change with it. For example, I'll set the stroke to 5 and we can see the endpoints change. However, if you want a small stroke but a larger endpoint, if you look carefully in the stroke panel, we can see under the endpoint we have these percentages. Here, I'll set the stroke size to 1, set the scale of the start point to 300, and we can now see that the endpoint is larger than the proportion of the stroke size. So that's how we can apply basic stroke effects to lines, create custom strokes, and apply endpoints. Now, strokes can also work very dynamically on frames. So I'll come over to the Tools menu, grab the Rectangle tool, come across and click and drag on my pointers to create an empty square frame. Now, earlier we learned how easy it is to apply a fill effect. It's just as easy to apply a stroke effect. With our new frame selected, we can simply come over to the stroke panel, click on the drop down and add a stroke. In this instance, I'll add a solid stroke, set the width to 10 and set the color to black. Now, once you have a stroke applied to a frame, one feature to pay attention to is the stroke alignment. If we come to the stroke panel, we can see that we have 3 options we can consider here. By default, when you apply a stroke to a frame, it will be set to align the stroke to center. If we click the second option, we will align the stroke to the inside. With the selection tool, I'll click on my frame, press and hold Alt plus Shift and drag to the right. If we click back on the first option, we will align the stroke to the center. With the selection tool, I'll click on my frame, press and hold Alt plus Shift and drag to the right again. And if we click the third option, we can align the stroke to the outside. So center, inside and outside. Now, once you have a stroke applied to a frame, another feature to consider is corner options. So with the first frame selected, if we come up to Object, come down and click on Corner Options, up will pop a menu. Keep in mind, we can also access this from the Properties panel. With the frame selected, if we come into the Properties panel, we will also see the corner options visible in the Appearance section. If we click the corner option to the right, the Corner Options menu will appear. So I'll click on the Preview checkbox in the bottom left, and if we click on a drop-down tab for the top left, we can see some options. For this, I'll click on Bevel, and we will see the corners change on the stroke. Also, we can change the value of the bevel. For example, I'll change the value in each to 10, and that will drastically change the shape below. And I'll just change it back to 5 for now and click OK. I'll select the next shape, come back up to Object, click on Corner Options, and this time on the drop down, I'll set it to a rounded corner. Set the value to 10 for each and click OK. I'll select the last shape, back up to Object, click on Corner Options, and this time on the drop down, I'll set it to Inset. Set the value to 4 for each and click OK. And that's how you can apply corner effects to your strokes. Now, one last little trick to keep in mind. With the selection tool, if we click on a frame, you will notice this little yellow square. If you click this once, you will then see 4 yellow squares appear in the corners. This is a toggle that we can click and drag, which we can customize the value of the corners. And in this case, we can make the rounded corners larger or smaller. So earlier we looked at how easy it is to apply a gradient fill to a frame. Now, applying gradients to strokes can be just as easy. So with the selection tool, I'll click on my frame with the rounded corners, press and hold Alt and click and drag it down and then expand it across like so to match my pointers. Next, I'll come over to the Tools menu and make sure the stroke color is selected, and then over in the swatches, I'll click on the gradient stroke we created earlier. Upon click, we will apply the gradient effect, but in this case, we will also apply a radial gradient. So back into the gradient panel, I'll click the gradient type drop down, select linear, I'll set the stroke weight to 5. I'll come back into the Tools menu, click the gradient tool, and I can click and drag over my stroke area to redefine the angle of the gradient. And just like that, we have applied a gradient to the stroke. Easy. Now before we move on, there is one useful technique you should keep in mind, and that is cloning stroke effects. Earlier we learned how easy it is to clone fill effects from one frame to another. Well, this can be done just the same with stroke effects. So with the selection tool, I'll press and hold Alt and Shift and drag my new frame to the right to make a quick duplicate. Now, if for example, I want to apply the same wave stroke applied to one of the strokes in the overview spread, I can come and paste it below. I'll click on my new frame, then come into the tools menu, click on the eyedropper tool. Then it's just a case of clicking on the wavy stroke, and upon click that will apply the same stroke effect to my frame. If I come and click on the eyedropper tool again, and this time click on the dashed stroke, it will apply that effect. If I come and click on the eyedropper tool again, and this time click on the black stroke with the bevel corners, it will apply that effect. So those are the key things to keep in mind when working with stroke effects in InDesign. As you can see, there are a lot of settings you can alter and a lot of effects you can achieve. So now we know how fill effects work and how to work with strokes, we can start to bring it all together. Now another quick thing to keep in mind when working with strokes in InDesign is scaling. If we come and open the Preferences menu in InDesign and come to General, around halfway you will see the option for When Scaling. If you want your strokes to scale when you scale your objects, you will need this checked. And if you don't, simply uncheck this box. By default, I believe this is automatically checked to scale. But if you find your strokes are not scaling with your objects, then check this option in the Preferences. So on the last page of the worksheet, we have some common items one may apply fill and stroke effects to in InDesign. So let's look at applying some of the things we have just learned to some common items. So first, let's look at applying some stroke effects to some type. If we select the type frame with the selection tool, then double click to enter into and select the text, currently we can see it's set to black. If we click on the tools panel, at the bottom, if we click the swap fill and stroke, we can change the fill to a stroke effect. If we click on the stroke color, we can come up into the swatches panel and apply a gradient we created earlier. If we click on the gradient panel, we can set this to a linear or radial. In this instance, I'll set it to a linear, then come into the tools menu, click the gradient tool and click and drag to change the direction of the gradient. And in the stroke panel, we can change the weight of the stroke, and I'll set this to 2, press escape, and now we have the stroke effect with a gradient applied to the type. So below this, I have 2 empty circle frames ready to apply some effects to. With the selection tool, I'll click on the first circle frame. In the tools menu, I'll make sure the fill square is selected, and in the swatches panel, I can add a yellow fill and add a tint of 20. Back in the tools menu, I'll click on the stroke, set this to a blue color, and in the stroke panel, I'll hit the drop down and choose a wavy stroke, set the stroke size to 8, and just like that, we can apply a solid color and a stroke effect. With the selection tool, I'll click the next circle frame. This time, I'll select the eyedropper tool and then choose the effect from the first object. In the tools menu, I'll make sure the fill square is selected. In the swatches panel, I can add a cyan and make sure the tint is still set to 20. Back in the tools menu, I'll click on the stroke, set this to a gradient color. In the stroke panel, I'll hit the drop down and choose a thick tick stroke. Set the stroke size to 12, click into the gradient tool, click to change the direction, and just like that, we can clone the effect from one object and make quick changes. So to finish off, we're going to apply 2 effects. So below this, I have 2 empty square frames ready to apply some effects to. With the selection tool, I'll click on the first frame, I'll come up to Object, down to Corner Options. This time I'll make sure to click the Lock to unlock, and for the top left and right, I'll set this to round corners with a value of 25 each, and click OK. With the frame selected, I'll either come up to File Place or simply press Command+D on Mac or Control+D on PC on the keyboard. I'll navigate to the download folder, into folder 2, Practice Files, into the Assets folder, into the Images folder, into the JPEG folder, into the Multiple folders, and select Hummingbird1 JPEG and click Open. Press Command+Alt+Shift+E on Mac or Control+Alt+Shift+E on PC. We can fit the content proportionally inside the frame, and then scale to fit inside the frame with the direct selection tool. With the selection tool, I'll click on the next frame. With the frame selected, either come up to File Place or press Command+D on Mac or Control+D on PC. I'll navigate to the download folder, into folder 2, Practice Files, into the Assets folder, into the Images folder, into the PSD folder, and select Hot Air Balloons. Now before I click Open, I'll make sure that Show Import Options is checked below. I'll make sure that the Clouds and Balloons 1 layer is active and click OK. I'll press Command plus Alt plus Shift plus E on Mac, or Control plus Alt plus Shift plus E on PC, and we can fit the content proportionally inside the frame. With the Direct Selection tool, I'll click on the image and scale to fit inside the frame. I'll come up to Object, down to Corner Options. I'll make sure to click the lock icon to lock it this time. For the top, I'll set this to bevel with a value of 10, and it will apply that to all the others. I'll click OK, then into the stroke panel, add a thick, thin stroke, set the weight to 5, and set the alignment to outside, change the color to blue, and now we have two images in bespoke frames with bespoke stroke effects. So those are all the key principles you need to know when working with fill and stroke effects in InDesign. If you're new to InDesign, I'd recommend having a play around with this worksheet and exploring the fill and stroke effects on offer to get comfortable using them in InDesign. So now we are all clued up on how to use fill and stroke effects. It's now time to move on to the next step. So see you in the next video.